One of the biggest misconceptions about documentary filmmaking is that it's about cameras. People think documentary filmmakers spend their time thinking about lenses, cameras, settings, drones. We do, but honestly, that's not what takes up most of my mental energy. Documentary filmmaking is mostly about people, it's about relationships, it's about trust. And if you're making documentaries, sooner or later, you'll have to do something that makes most people uncomfortable. You'll have to approach strangers. Hi, I'm Stéphanie Saxema. I'm a documentary filmmaker and producer, and over the years I spent a lot of time approaching people I had never met before. Over the years I filmed activists, fishermen, community leaders, entrepreneurs, people living through difficult situations, really people whose stories mattered. Many of them were complete strangers when I first met them. And what I've learned is that access has very little to do with equipment, it has everything to do with trust. So why this matters? The reality is that without access, there is no documentary. You can have the best camera in the world, you can have a great idea, you can have funding, but if people don't trust you, you don't have a film. And I think this is one of the things beginners underestimate. They spend a lot of time learning technical skills, which is important, but documentary filmmaking is also a human skill. Two filmmakers can have the same exact story idea. One ends up making a powerful film, and the other never gets beyond the first conversation. The difference is often access, and access comes from relationships, once for all. One mistake I see a lot is that filmmakers approach people because they want something. They want an interview, they want a character, they want access, they want a story. And people can feel that. Most of us can tell when somebody is genuinely curious and when somebody simply wants something from us. When I approach someone, I'm not thinking, how do I convince this person to be in my film? I'm thinking, who is this person? What matters to them? What is their experience? What can I learn from them? Because before someone becomes a character, they're a human being. And I think that's important to remember. One thing that helped me tremendously when I started documentary filmmaking was a sort of personal experiment. At the time, I was much more shy than I am today. Approaching strangers didn't come naturally to me at all. So I decided to force myself to practice. I would get in my car, drive around Martinique, my country, and simply pay attention. Whenever I saw something interesting, I would stop. And I didn't have a film, I didn't have a project. I was just being curious. And sometimes maybe it was a fisherman, maybe someone repairing something, maybe someone working in the field, maybe a group of people playing dominoes. And I would walk up to them and start a conversation. That was it. No grand strategy, no complicated technique. Just, hi, how are you? And yeah, what are you doing? How long have you been doing this? Most of the time, people would become curious too, especially because I usually had a camera with me. They would ask me, are you a photographer? What are you filming? What are you working on? And a conversation would naturally begin. And over time, I realized something important. Most people are actually willing to talk. Not everyone, but many people are. The difficult part is often not them, it's us. It's a story we tell ourselves before we even approach them. So what I actually do today? Today my process is still surprisingly simple. First I observe, I don't immediately walk up to someone. I watch, I try to understand what they're doing. I look for what interests me. Then I approach, I say hello, I introduce myself, I ask questions. Of course I listen, and only later, if it feels appropriate, I will bring up filming. And I think that's another mistake beginners often make. They lead with the camera. I try to lead with curiosity. The camera comes later. Because people don't trust camera. People trust people. Another lesson I've learned is not to let the importance of the project overwhelm the interaction. Sometimes we want access so badly. We want the film to happen so badly. We become anxious. We become nervous. We become afraid of hearing no. And suddenly, we're not really talking to a person anymore. We're talking to a potential character, to a potential film. And people can feel that pressure. What helps me is remembering that this conversation matters more than the film. The person in front of me matters more than the project. The goal is not to get access, it's to connect. And if access comes later, that's great. Of course, sometimes people say no, and that's completely normal. In fact, some of the most interesting stories I've encountered never became films. Sometimes people aren't ready. Sometimes they don't trust you. They just don't. Sometimes it's simply not the right moment. And I've learned not to take that personally. A no isn't always a rejection of you. Sometimes it's a reflection of where that person is in their life. And one thing documentary filmmaking teaches very quickly is that you cannot force access. You can invite people into a process, but you cannot force them into it. The longer I make documentaries, the less I think access is about persuasion, and the more I think it's about listening. People spend a lot of time being questioned, being analyzed, being asked to explain themselves, but very few people feel genuinely heard. And I think that's one of the reasons documentary filmmaking still matters, because taking the time to listen can reveal things that would otherwise remain invisible. For me, every documentary begins with a conversation, and every conversation begins with curiosity. Not with filming, not with storytelling, not with content, with curiosity. And that's still how I approach strangers today. So, what's been your experience approaching people? Is that something that comes naturally to you, or is it something you've had to learn? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.